Council, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Our speaker this evening is Robert Kagan, and he will be discussing his most recent book entitled The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World. In it, he demonstrates once again that he is one of America's foremost foreign policy analysts who consistently provides remarkable insights, especially when explaining the past and connecting our foreign policy future. We are so pleased to welcome him back to this podium, and please know how grateful we are that you honored your commitment to make the treacherous journey from Washington to New York this evening. I think that deserves a medal. And it's no secret that for some years now, America has been withdrawing from its leadership role around the globe. While this shift in American attitudes began before Mr. Trump took office, since moving into the White House, this president has moved rather quickly to effectively dismantle a host of international pacts. From abandoning the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal with Asia, to withdrawing from the Worldwide Climate Change Accord, to pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement, President Trump is rewriting the compact between the United States and our allies, especially those in Europe. As Trump works to erode the rules-based international order, these actions present a tectonic shift in America's relations with its allies and is likely to leave the United States confronting a more dangerous and less prosperous future. In The Jungle Grows Back, our speaker tells us that the liberal world order that the U.S. helped to build and sustain following the end of World War II, with its democratic principles, respect for national borders, independent judiciary, and relatively free movement of goods and ideas, was not natural. It was a post-war world in disarray that needed to be built and carefully maintained so that the world could be peaceful and more prosperous. Yet now, as the United States abandons its role as global leader, retreating from functioning as the enforcer of the liberal order, the world is inching closer to a dark jungle of competing interests, clashing nationalism, tribalism, and self-interest, which reverts back to the pre-War II era. The questions are, what will happen if we continue to pull back and withdraw even further? What impact does an American first philosophy portend for the future of our country and for the world? For the answers, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to a person who has an acute understanding of the past, is an astute observer of the present, and a prognosticator of the future. Our guest this evening, the intrepid traveler, Bob Kagan.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I mean, usually it's treacherous going from New York to Washington, for other reasons, but I did manage to leave a snowstorm that was ending in Washington and come to a snowstorm that was in full fury here in New York. I had to be here because I have to honor my commitment. You do not have to be here, and so I'm very grateful to you for braving the weather and coming out to talk about foreign policy, which I have to say makes you special in America these days. I was looking at the exit polls from the recent midterm elections, and I kept going up and down the questions looking for a question on foreign policy. And it's pretty clear that foreign policy is pretty much the last thing on the average American's mind. That's often true in midterm elections, but you'd think out of 25 exit poll questions, one would be on foreign policy. And I think the only question was, how do you like Donald Trump's foreign policy? Because of course it has to be about Donald Trump all the time. So, which indicates to me something that I think was pretty apparent anyway, which is that although there are many of us, and probably many people in this room, who are troubled by this America First approach to the world that President Trump has enunciated, but that going to the UN and saying something that no American president, even before World War II, has ever said, which is basically, we are going to look out for ourselves, and we suggest you guys look out for yourselves as well. That Americans are not, at the very least, they're not very troubled about this. They may even be very much, a majority may be very much in agreement with this general approach. And I think that is a problem that preceded Donald Trump. I think the fact that Donald Trump got elected is in some respect a reflection of the fact that people felt this way before he took office. And I think unfortunately, it's going to be a problem that exists even after Donald Trump is gone, whether it's 2020 or 2024, because I think Americans have actually been in this mood for quite some time. I think we all know that the reaction to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had a lot to do with it. I think the financial crisis of 2008 and the consequences of that crisis playing out into the Great Recession had a lot to do with it. But I could trace this mood even further back in time. I think it really began after 1989 and the end of the Cold War, at which point I think a lot of Americans thought, so now we don't have to do this stuff anymore. And I think ever since the end of the Cold War, if you look at every intervention that's been undertaken, even the ones that we look back on as being successful, like the first Gulf War led by George H.W. Bush, you may recall that public opinion was very divided on that. The Senate vote was 52 to 48, and that really every use of force, and not just use of force, but trade agreements and other key elements of America's role in the world, I think Americans have been increasingly questioning. And I don't think we should be shocked that they're questioning it and that they are asking why. Because let's not forget that America has been playing, since the end of World War II, a highly unusual role in the world. I would say it's a role in the world that no other nation in history has ever played. No other nation in history has ever taken this degree of responsibility for global security, for the peace and stability of regions that are thousands of miles away from the homeland. And so it has been an abnormal role. And so when people say, can't we return to normal, it seems to be a reasonable question. And I also think that when those of us who use this sort of not very lovely phrase, the liberal world order, I wish I had a better phrase. I have toyed with other phrases to describe what was created, but I haven't really come up with a better one. But I think that Americans have a number of misconceptions about this international system that the United States created after World War II, which in a way help undermine their support for it. The first one I've already indicated, which is the belief that this order was created in response to the Soviet Union and the onset of the Cold War. I find even highly educated people like Graham Allison at Harvard saying that the liberal world order was created in response to the Cold War. But as it happens, that is historically inaccurate. That really the basic outlines and even some of the key elements of this liberal world order were created before anyone thought there was going to be a problem with the Soviet Union. The basic vision and some of the basic elements of this order were established during World War II. Certainly Bretton Woods Conference is 1944. The decision to start having bases around the world from which the United States could operate in both Europe and Asia, those strings of bases were being planned as early as 1943 by American strategic planners. And the basic idea that the United States after World War II was going to have to play an entirely different role in the world than it had played prior to World War II was firmly fixed at a time when Uncle Joe Stalin was still our ally, when people like Franklin Roosevelt and Dean Acheson and others thought that the post-war world would be one of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Cold War actually came as a kind of surprise, and people sort of woke up in early 1946 or roughly thereabout. So that's one misconception, and it's related to another misconception, I think, which is that I think a lot of people, when they hear the phrase liberal world order or they hear people talk about this, think that this order is based on some very idealistic notion of remaking the world in America's image. You hear that all the time, that it's a kind of Wilsonian project, a kind of utopian idea of making a brand new world based on a very optimistic assessment of what can be accomplished in the world. As a matter of fact, the founders of this liberal world order it was really based on a deep pessimism about both the international system and about human nature, and a pessimism that was hard earned for that generation that lived through World War I, the 20s, and then the 30s, and then World War II. And that really is the generation of Franklin Roosevelt and Dean Acheson and Harry Truman and others, many people, most of whom were born in the latter part of the 19th century and went through that entire sort of history of disaster in which the worst acts of inhumanity that anyone could ever imagine took place. And so they had a very, I would say, dark view of humanity. I think they worked on the assumption that the natural tendency of the international system was toward chaos and conflict, because that is what they had witnessed. And I think that they had no illusions about human nature necessarily being a benevolent force in the world. I think they were hopeful that human beings, sort of better angels, could be appealed to, but they built a system that was really designed to contain those other angels, the not better angels, the sort of darker forces. And in this respect, I think they were very much like the founders of the American Republic, who also did not base the American system on a sort of optimistic reading of human nature, but really on the assumption that human beings could be counted on to behave selfishly and to pursue their ambitions regardless of others. And so they created this famous system of checks and balances and other institutional structures in the hope of channeling these other forces of human nature in a positive direction. I think that's essentially what the founders of the liberal world order set up. And I think that they probably in their wildest dreams did not imagine how successful this order that they set up would be. I really do think they were trying to stave off the worst disasters. They were, like all statesmen, focus on preventing what just happened from ever happening again. They're very infrequently are people looking that far ahead into the future. And so the order they created was designed to prevent the things that they had already seen. And just to think about what the basic elements of this order are, and Joanne actually sort of laid out what they are, but as they looked back on the period leading up to World War II, they saw that on the one hand, protectionist sentiment and efforts by the various power blocks to create autarkic economic spheres in which they would be dominant and would not actually engage in trade with one another. This was Hitler's ambition for Germany, that he would create a European market which would not depend on anyone else. It was certainly the Japanese goal with the Asian co-prosperity sphere, which was to be dominant in its own economic bloc. And then, of course, America played along for its own purposes with protectionist policies in the 1920s and then accelerating into the 1930s. And I think, so the founders of the order looked back on that and said that was a disaster. That not only did it actually lead to, bad economic consequences, which created poverty, which created radicalism and discontent, but it also sort of drove a deeper wedge between nations and sort of took already existing geopolitical competition and making it, and sort of exacerbating it by turning it as well into an economic competition. And that's why they wanted to establish as much of a free trading, open global economy as possible. Not, again, out of some idealistic belief that this would make all people behave better, but because they'd seen what the consequences of not having that kind of system were. And so I feel like, this is just an example, when you say to people today, here's the problem with protectionism, I don't think they're thinking about that problem. I think all they're thinking about is, well, haven't we been too nice to all other powers? And so this kind of, the reason why we have this order has been forgotten. And then, of course, they also believed, I think with some reason, that tyrannies were more likely to be aggressive than democracies. I don't think they were under any illusion that they were going to create a democratic world, but they did want to create what Dean Acheson called an environment of freedom so that the United States democracy, at least, could continue to flourish. They were very worried, and this is something Franklin Roosevelt talked about in the late 1930s as Hitler and Germany were consolidating their position in Europe and moving forward, and as the Japanese were consolidating their position in Asia, that if the United States lived in a world in which that was dominated everywhere else by militaristic dictatorships, ultimately this would force the United States itself to change its character in order to defend itself and protect itself. The government would have to become much more involved, and I don't mean involved the way Republicans and conservatives complain about it today, but they were thinking about having to have a truly directed economy that would allow the production of military equipment to keep up with the Nazis and the Japanese empire, and that ultimately American democracy would have a very hard time surviving. So what they decided was necessary to create this environment of freedom in which the American experiment could continue was to at least have in the key strategic areas, basically on the other side of the oceans, on the shores of the other side of oceans at least, to have democratic governments. And that's why they believed it was so important to transform Germany from a dictatorship to democracy and to anchor a democratic systems in Europe. And again, this precedes even the threat of communism and the Soviet Union, although that certainly added to their apprehension and their belief that this was necessary, and also to convert Japan to a democracy. And then finally, they had decided that it was simply not sufficient for the United States to sit, as Acheson put it, as if in a parlor with a shotgun over your lap waiting for the bad guys to come, but that it would be necessary to extend the reach of American power to prevent the momentum, to prevent these other forces or militaristic governments from rising up to the point where they could then look to the United States. So they wanted to be preventive and preemptive in the establishment and permanent presence of American military power overseas. I don't think they quite imagined how long that would have to be, but they certainly did believe it would have to be for a long time. So, those are the nuts and bolts of this order. So again, when you think about the liberal world order, let's not think in idealistic terms. Let's talk about nuts and bolts efforts to prevent a return to the disastrous situation that had existed prior to World War II. And the amazing thing is, as I say, they were so successful. In a way, the liberal world order was so successful that to the point of perhaps leading to its own undoing. Because I think what has happened, and this gets to sort of the third misconception that I think plagues us today about the liberal world order, is that people began to believe that this extraordinary situation that we've been living in since World War II is simply the new normal, that this is the way things are, that they can count on a certain level of global peace, a certain amount of democratic government around the world, a certain level of global prosperity, and like human beings often do in our own lives, we tend to take for granted all the things that are good and are working and focus all on the things that are not working and the things that we're not happy about. You know how sometimes we have to remind ourselves to count our blessings. And I think it's been a while since the American public sort of counted their blessings. And so we have been focusing on all the ways in which we're not content with the international system, all the ways we focus on the costs of maintaining it, not on the benefits that we get from its existence. We assume, as I said, that it's basically permanent and only focus on the things about it that we don't like. And so I think it is worth just, again, briefly remarking on what an extraordinary period this has been, because I read a lot of articles in the academic literature and elsewhere, and you certainly get this from Donald Trump and his supporters, and as well as from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, all the things that have been terrible about this liberal world order. So let me just at least take a minute to just describe what's been remarkable about it. And it's obvious. The first is prosperity. Throughout all of human history, as far back as we have any recorded history, the average human being has lived a life of abject poverty. There's been nothing like prosperity for 99.99% of human beings throughout history. The only global economic growth that had ever occurred began in the late 18th century with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And then, economists measure global GDP annual growth in the neighborhood of 1.5 or maybe 1.8% a year. But since the end of the Second World War, the entire world has enjoyed something like 4% global annual GDP growth, which has been just absolutely miraculous compared to history. And the consequence has been that 4 billion people have lifted themselves out of poverty during this period, and we have the largest middle class ever known to the human race. And the sort of the bounty of this prosperity has been spread remarkably around the world to include hitherto undeveloped and poor regions like China and India and elsewhere. So this has been an absolutely miraculous period in that respect. It's obviously been a miraculous period from the point of view of the spread of democracy. Democracy was the rarest form of government for time immemorial, so rare as to be almost an accident whenever it appeared. And since World War II, we've seen the growth of democracy to the point where over 100 nations in the world today are democracies, and roughly half of the world's people live under democratic governments, absolutely unprecedented. And then finally, there has been the absence of great power war. Now, there's been wars. The United States, of course, has been involved in wars, but the kind of cataclysmic great power conflict like World War I and World War II and the Napoleonic Wars and the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, we have not had. And that's also an anomaly, because if you look at the entire sweep of human history, there is barely a year that you can find over the last 5,000 when the great powers or great nation states or great city-states or great empires have not been at war with one another. And we've been living in a period absent that, and therefore absent the cataclysmic consequences of those wars, not just for the nations fighting them, but for everybody else, as we saw in World War I and World War II. So this period, if you think about all three of those things, any single one of them would make this a unique period in history. The fact that we've had all three of them make it a miraculous period in history. And yet somehow we manage to take it for granted, and we also think that it is normal, that it's some product of human evolution, that people have just gotten better. That's why things are better, because people have gotten better. We had the argument of Frank Fukuyama in 1989, the end of his famous end of history essay, in which the argument was, in a kind of Hegelian dialectic, that the competing ideas of how humans could govern themselves had fought its way out, and liberal democracy had triumphed, and that was the end of it. He didn't claim there would be no more trouble, but he did say liberal democracy had triumphed because it was the one form of government that best met the basic needs of human nature, for the basic desires of human beings for recognition of their selves, of their rights, of their dignity, etc. And even today, if you read the works of Steven Pinker, who has documented, I think, better than anybody, what a remarkable period this has been in terms of how humans behave toward each other, to the point where it's not just that wars are less frequent, but even violence of individuals against each other has been less frequent. And what is his explanation for this? Well, his explanation is that the ideals and principles of the Enlightenment have finally really taken hold. Now, you know, these principles have been around for over 300 years. And you would not have said in 1939 that they had taken hold, but then suddenly, you know, they have taken hold. I must say the historian in me says that's highly unlikely. So the point is that we have been living in not the sort of on a new plateau of human existence. We've been living in something that I think is more frightening if you think about it. You might say, and I do argue, that what we've been living in is an aberration. It's unusual. It's unnatural. That what we've been living in was something that was created, and it is the reflection of a certain configuration of power in the international system. It's the creation that one might expect if, as it happens, the most powerful nation in the world happens to be a nation founded on Enlightenment principles, happens to believe in all these things that have spread, happens to have been itself an engine of capitalism. Every order in history has reflected the preferences and predilections of the power or powers that dominated that order. The Egyptian order reflected Egyptian preferences. The Roman order reflected Roman preferences. The European order of the early 19th century reflected the aristocratic and monarchic preferences of the European powers, and so it's not surprising that this order has reflected the fundamentally sort of Enlightenment approach that Americans prefer. So my argument is that this is something that has been created and something, therefore, that can be uncreated. And not only can be uncreated, but almost certainly will be uncreated, sorry to keep repeating that bad word, unless the effort is made to prevent that from happening. And so let me just end on this point, because I want to leave a lot of time for us to have a discussion about this. The analogy that is sort of at the heart of this book is about a jungle and a garden. And I think, I'm not much of a gardener myself, but I understand the principles of a garden. And I'm sure you all, many of you are gardeners, even in New York. And we all understand, first of all, that a garden is an unnatural creation. It's not something that produces itself. It's something that human beings create, and they create it by cutting back part of the weeds and the vines and pulling up tree stumps and rocks and creating a place where you can have a garden. And we also know that you don't just plant a garden, congratulate yourself, walk away, and expect to come back a week later and see the garden still there. We all know that if you aren't constantly tending the garden, then natural forces, weeds and vines and all the other things want to come back and reclaim the land. They're not, by the way, they're not even evil. They're just there. That's just nature having its way. And so in order to have a garden, sustain a garden, you've got to be constantly gardening. And I think that is, for me at least, a good analogy for this liberal world order, which itself is an unnatural creation, which natural forces are always working to undermine. As I mentioned, one of those natural forces is just the natural state of international relations, which tends toward chaos and conflict. It doesn't tend toward peace and order. Peace and order are created. They're not the natural outcome of natural forces in the international system. And then, in maybe even more troubling, but certainly I think we can see around the world how true it is, that there are forces of human nature that also work inevitably against this liberal world order. And so while it is true, as Frank and Hegel said, that yes, human beings do seek recognition, and I think there are very strong impulses in human nature that lend to the desire for individual rights and freedoms and the kind of liberal democratic system that can support and recognize them. But that's not the only thing that human beings have impulses toward and the only thing that human beings need. Human beings also search for security. And it's the kind of security that can be found in family and tribe. Human beings have spiritual needs, which liberalism doesn't solve. They have feelings of a need to they have an identity that is not just satisfied by being granted rights, as we've seen around the world. And, there is a constant struggle in human nature. And by the way, there are times when human beings want a strong leader, both to protect them, to protect not only their security, their physical security, but their cultural security, their sense of group identity. And by the way, sometimes human beings even don't want to make decisions. They want someone to make decisions for them. I think we have to admit that that is also an impulse. And so, I think we always wanted to believe that all peoples everywhere, if given the opportunity, would of course choose liberalism and democracy. It's only these dictators who are preventing them from acquiring those things. I think we have to be a little bit more realistic and understand that they don't always choose that. That there will certainly be periods of time, at least, in which human beings will choose, again, family, tribe, the strong man, the defense of their culture over democracy. And I think we're seeing that in places like Hungary and Poland and Russia too, where people are choosing a strong leader like Viktor Orban to protect the things that they think are being threatened by liberalism as well as by refugees from the Middle East. And so there's nothing unnatural about the fact that even in the heart of what we like to call, some people call the Western culture or the Western civilization, that we're seeing these urges for tribalism and nationalism. By the way, we're seeing them in our own country as well. And so at the end of the day, my final point is I don't believe in fatalism in either direction. I don't believe it was right for us to believe that democracy and liberalism and capitalism were the end point of human existence to which we were naturally moving, and therefore we could just sit back and enjoy the flowering and the triumph of liberal democracy, which was the view back in 1989 and in the 1990s. And I also don't believe that the view prevalent today that democracy is doomed. There is a constant struggle. There is a fight in all of us, really, within our nature, between different forces and different needs. And I think that the question that we really face right now is whether, in the same way that the founders of this international order decided that this order had to be created, it had to be imposed in many respects, it had to be backed by power, we now have to decide whether we're going to take the necessary steps to preserve it or whether we're going to watch as the jungle grows back and we move back to the normal circumstances that existed before we created this system. So that's the question that we're facing today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, you may not be a gardener, but I think you planted seeds so we can have a very fertile discussion.
That would be great.
Okay. So I just ask you, those who have questions, if they can go to either side of the microphone and just introduce yourself and try to keep your question somewhat brief. Thank you.
My name is Larry Bridwell. I would like you to comment on the future of the World Trade Organization, because the Special Trade Representative Lighthizer and President Trump, they've essentially paralyzed the dispute settlement process. So when you're talking about this garden, and a major part of the gardening has been done by the World Trade Organization, and because of U.S. actions, it's on the verge of falling apart.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question, and I think there really is reason to be concerned because, again, although Trump and the Trump administration have taken this to its sort of almost its extreme version and wants to view trade in a zero-sum way with every single nation in the world, including our allies, which essentially breaks the fundamental bargain at the heart of this liberal world order. And I just want to say a word about that. Countries at the end of World War II, not only Germany and Japan, but Britain and France, gave up essentially being the world powers that they had always been geopolitically and militarily, and basically ceded to the United States geopolitical hegemony within the liberal world order. In return, the United States did its best, not disregarding inevitable selfishness and mistakes here and there, but the basic deal was, we are not going to use our power to prevent you from getting rich. And in a way, the United States pursued what I like to call the Hyman Roth approach to foreign policy. For those of you who remember Godfather 2, I'm getting a lot of quizzical looks here, so maybe that movie. Anyway, Hyman Roth always made money for his partners. That's how come he survived as long as he did. But the United States, one of the great successes of American foreign policy has depended on our partners doing well, sometimes doing better than we were doing. The German auto industry was doing better than the American auto industry. We remember the panic. Some of you may remember how panicked we were that the Japanese were overtaking us. But that was actually part of the glue that held this order together. That's a long way of answering your question. So now if we are, and the WTO was sort of, again, a rules-based system where we would allow ourselves to be constrained just like everyone else was constrained by these rules. And that sort of created this relatively open playing field, which we are now not willing to play on. My concern is that I don't know that there is even a scintilla of domestic opposition to Trump's trade policies. The one place where you might expect it, you wouldn't expect it, the Democratic Party is not more committed to free trade than the Republican Party is. And so the advent of a Democratic House, I think, is not going to serve as a check on Trump's trade policies. I think that the American public, it's been so long since they have heard an argument for free trade and the rules of the trading system. The other side has dominated the discussion. And so we are a long way from turning around public opinion on that, is my concern.
Yeah, Anthony Fales. There's certainly been this idea that if we integrated China in the global system, that they would behave more like us, their values would be more like ours. Now, that is clearly being called into question recently with the rise of Xi Jinping, a range of different issues. How are we to handle China? To what extent are they integrated in this global order? To what extent should our trade be integrated with them when we have obvious difference in values, discussions about them implanting chips in things that might be part of the defense industry,
Yep.
spying on American citizens? There's a whole range of issues. What ought to be the way that we handle them?
It's a very good question, and it's obviously not a very easy question to answer, but I'll do my best. I actually think that, first of all, we are not going to stop trading with China. And so the notion that we are going to somehow find a way of separating our economy from their economy, I just think that's not in the offing. Our businesses are not going to allow that to happen, and our economies are too tightly intertwined, I think, to really provide any real separation. So that leaves us with, what I think is, and I say this as someone who's been more concerned about China than everybody else for much longer, and I never believed that that the Chinese were going to be made over into our image if only we traded for them. I've never believed that. I actually opposed letting China into the WTO because I was worried about the corrupting influence that they would have, which I think is true. So I yield to very few people on my hawkishness when it comes to China. But I think that what we really ought to be offering to China is, in a sense, the same deal that we've offered to all the great powers in the system. And that deal is, we are not going to stand in the way of your being economically successful. Yes, we want you to behave on on intellectual property rights. No, we don't want you robbing from our industries and including our defense industries, and those are all issues that we have to deal with. But our general approach, it seems to me, is that we do not stand in the way of China's economic success. What we will stand in the way of is their military, is their use of their military to achieve their goals. And I think that instead of doing what we are doing right now, which is squeezing them economically while our ability to deter them militarily declines, which if you do that, I think we ought to know where that ends. If we're squeezing them economically, but we're not deterring them militarily, what choice are they going, what's the choice they're going to make? I would rather do the opposite. I would rather allow them to succeed economically and deter them militarily in the hopes that that will send them in a more positive direction. I actually believe that I talked about how we can't separate ourselves from the Chinese. The Chinese really can't separate themselves from us. They are absolutely dependent on our market. They are entangled with us financially. And so they also have some disincentive to disrupting the system if we are clearly determined to hold our position, to defend our allies, and to deter their geopolitical expansion. I don't know whether that gives us a 1 in 3 chance of avoiding conflict or a 1 in 2 chance of avoiding conflict, but I do think it's our best hope. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Follow up is
Yeah.
in the other instances where we faced off, you said to offer the basic bargain.
Yeah.
We didn't offer that basic bargain to the Soviet Union. We didn't offer.
No, we did actually.
We didn't.
No, not at the
integrate
beginning.
our defense industry with it. We didn't
No.
provide things
When we
that
offered it,
needed.
right.
We didn't do that with Nazi Germany. I mean, sure, we might not have been fighting with them, but we certainly didn't integrate our supply chain in a way that there could be a really deleterious effect to our own economy and our own defense system.
We certainly didn't do it with Japan.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Well, that's a different issue, but we did offer them basically the bargain that they could succeed. I'm not talking about obviously we don't have every detail exactly the same, but the basic bargain was you forego geopolitical ambition and succeed economically. That's the bargain we gave Germany. We didn't offer it to them. That's the bargain we insisted on with Germany and Japan. That's the bargain that France and Britain took. And that is the bargain that Russia toyed with after the end of the Cold War and ultimately rejected. Okay, so there's no guarantee that, and I think China has rejected it so far too. In which case, then all we can do is deter them militarily. I would be willing to explore the idea, and I know people like Robert Blackwell and Ashley Tellis have written an article on this. There is a strategy of basically being in a full-scale Cold War relationship with them, where we are, minimizing our economic exposure, and we are basically squeezing them economically and militarily at the same time. I just have to say I'm wary of doing that, partly because I don't know that we can. I mean, we as a nation, Lenin wasn't totally wrong about us when he said we would sell the rope to hang ourselves with. It's very hard for us to forego the Chinese market. And I don't know whether we can succeed in doing that. So what I fear is that we'll bluster a lot and we'll half-heartedly squeeze them at the same time that we're not deterring them militarily. And that, to me, is a recipe for conflict. So, again, if somebody could tell me, don't worry about it, we'll squeeze them, we'll go all out, etc., then I would say, okay, I'm willing to give it a shot. But I'm skeptical.
I'm going to take both these questions, one right after the other, because I promised Bob that a car would be here to take him back to the train station, to take him back to Washington.
Because it'll take an hour and a half to get back to the train
Right.
station.
So if you could make your question brief.
Bradley
And then,
from the New School. On the one hand, I admire what you said, and above all, I admire the conviction with which you spoke. I find I am basically in total disagreement with what you say. What, in my opinion, you are doing is totally destroying the Enlightenment. You, of course, mentioned Fukuyama. That's an ancient, long overcome issue. as I'm sure you know, and Fukuyama has rescinded and all of this. But what you are denying by saying the current situation is an aberration is the thought that I thought we were growing up with. Enlightenment, progress, education, advancement on every level. The reason, in my opinion, why we no longer have the great wars that you had mentioned is simply because the big powers know that there is no longer a great war without self-destruction. It's not that we don't want the others to be destroyed.
Excuse me,
We don't
Ernestine,
want
but could
our,
you just
yeah, I
come to
know.
question, because
I'm
really,
so
we're not-
sorry,
Yeah,
but
know.
I am, as you can
But
tell,
you know what? I
very
understand.
upset with
I
what
understand
you
exactly
said.
what you're saying because yes, I am directly arguing with that position.
And
So,
totally, in
yeah,
the end, for nothing,
Yeah.
you mentioned the word leader.
yeah,
Okay,
Yeah,
Pete,
yeah.
okay.
I'm sorry, I made a promise, he made a commitment, and I'm honoring his commitment by getting him back to the train.
Peter Russell. You talked a lot about the public mood and public opinion and the loss of vision about the liberal international order. So my question simply is, where are and who are the gardeners? How is it that we lost this legacy of awareness and attention?
Well, I'm going to answer that question before I grapple with the Enlightenment. So, as someone who's been, the last 35 years studying American history, I don't want us to have an overly rosy view of how wonderful we used to be, because there have certainly in the first century of our history, after we got past the sort of brilliant diplomacy of the first decade, which was sort of our birth and survival diplomacy. We didn't take diplomacy very seriously. As a nation, we didn't think it mattered very much. We'd had very few ambassadors overseas, and the ones we had were not particularly chosen for their skills as ambassadors. And that didn't really change in any fundamental way until after World War II, at which point we decided we had to take this stuff very seriously all of a sudden, and we did take it very seriously. How many people, think about that anymore? We returned, in a way, to form. And returning to form is that, and this is something that's really basic to Americans, and even today it's sort of amazing to say this, but I think it's true. I still think we think we're protected by two oceans. I still think we think that everything is way out there and it's not really our problem, and the rest of the world can go to hell and we'll be fine. And so it's very easy for us to say, and therefore we can cut our foreign aid budget, and we can not have Syria, we can go without having a diplomat in Saudi Arabia for 2.5 years, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know what it's going to take. My wife was a gardener. She worked in the State Department as a diplomat. She served in the Foreign Service for 35 years. And she didn't feel that if she stayed in the State Department under this administration, she'd be given any chance to do what she'd been doing. And so she resigned on inauguration day. She didn't wait to be shuffled out. But so if you want to know what's happening to the gardeners, they're retiring. Now, I also can say, though, there is a younger generation that is getting back into it. And I think that I find young people right now realize that they know they're in a dangerous world. And I think more of them are actually starting to engage in a way. So I don't want to say the children are our future, but I do have some hope for the next generation, actually. Now that our generation has messed everything up. And I'm going to end on talking about the Enlightenment. The one thing I like about this is that we have a pure philosophical disagreement, and it cuts through all the complexities of everything. I don't believe in the Enlightenment idea of human moral progress. I believe, obviously, that there is scientific progress, there has been an expansion of knowledge, but the expectation that this would lead to an improvement in human behavior, which is the core Enlightenment concept, I think has proved fallacious. And I think we do teach ourselves a Whig history where we focus only on the progress and don't focus on the regress. But I will say this. People writing in 1939, if you read Hannah Arendt in 1950, if you look at political philosophers both before, during, and after the war, they said then, and this is less than 70 years ago, that it was absurd to talk about human progress. Okay? So how you want to? I mean, I don't know how you want to go back and forth on this. I mean, I think I'm going to get the last word just because of
I
the
think I'll
snow.
give you the last word.
But
I cannot argue, but the 100th anniversary, a few days ago.
yeah,
Just look at the pictures, and you see Europe, West Europe, united in a way that it was not.
and now I'm also seeing it.
It's a progress.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree. I think, in fact, we're now seeing the disintegration of that very Western Europe. We are now seeing Europe returning to its nationalist past. And I do think that I absolutely believe that what Europe was able to accomplish could not have been accomplished had it not been for the United States. And by the way, Europeans agree with that too.
But it's still progress.
Okay, I will take the liberty of ending this and ask you to join me in thanking Bob for his commitment, his discussion, and for just being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And his book is available. We have signed copies for you to purchase, and I just think I have to take them now and get them into the car. So please join us and continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.